so happy to have you on the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be here.
Amazing. For those people who don't know you, could you alleviate the burden of me of trying to introduce you and squeeze the totality of your character in a couple of sentences? Maybe you ask people, you help me with this right away. Who are you?
Sure. Well, I'm a person who's had some diverse life experiences. I had a business career before medical school. I became a physician and a psychiatrist, and I've worked in a lot of different settings, both inside and outside of healthcare, and ultimately felt a lot of frustration with how the systems that are supposed to help us actually work. And this led me to found Pacific Premier Group, which is where I work now. And there are about 24 of us that provide clinical, coaching, and consulting services. And we see the world primarily through the lens of trauma. Not everything, of course, arises from trauma, but I think that's the primary lens through which we try to do the helping work that we do. And I wrote the book in large part to spread the word about trauma and its impact on us, of course, as individual people, but more broadly as a society. I mean, the individuals we all are make up societies that decide priorities and decide how to treat people and how we're going to try and move ourselves into the future, which is not so obvious. It's probably never been so obvious, but it's clear at this point in time. It's not so obvious how to do that. So our feeling is by helping people as best we can, we help us all into the future if we can play some small part in that.
Thank you for helping me out here. I became to know you particularly through a couple of interviews and works that you did with the likes of Tim Ferriss, Angie Jimenez, and Louise Hose, who introduced you as one of the premier thought leaders in the field of psychiatry, particularly also with trauma. And before we get going, like one of the intentions that I have for this interview is not only to go a little bit on a journey with you and learn about how you became the great person that you obviously are and understand a little bit from your journey of becoming, but also give people a different perspective of what trauma is, how to solve it, because I'm pretty sure that everybody who's listening to this right now has had trauma happen to them in their life, or it's going to happen to them soon, hope not, of course, or is happening to one of their loved ones. So this is something that in my country is very much not talked about enough. So this is a huge honor and opportunity for me. And I hope that the people who are listening to this, that you will take something away from this. And I urge you to not only buy like Paul's book, but also listen to the other interviews of the people who are much better at this craft than I am right now. So that would be a guard. Maybe we start at your journey. Like, what's a good starting point there? So my first question would be like, if you would write an autobiography, like what would be the title of the first epoch, and what would be the stories that this chapter of your life would entail?
Well, I mean, I'd probably call the first chapter foundational. You know, I was fortunate to, I think, have a good foundation. I did not have big childhood trauma. I was fortunate to have caring and loving parents and good supportive people around me, and to sort of learn lessons that gave me confidence in myself and also let me understand how to deal to some degree with setbacks, you know, trying things and not being so good at them, and navigating frustration and exploring and understanding self in the service of choosing a direction, right? Of deciding to be sort of academically oriented and involved in the world around me. It was a lot easier for me to do that with the stable foundation that I had, and I'm particularly attuned to this because when people don't have the foundation, it is so much harder. And then again, I know our conversation is about trauma, and you're asking about my life, and I think I'm fortunate that I did not have trauma in those foundational years, and then I can see in retrospect how helpful that was to me in then navigating the traumas that I did have later on, which really increases my attunement to trauma in childhood and how it can make navigating life, which is difficult under any circumstances, even more difficult.
Mhm. That's very interesting that you made an emphasis right away on the point of gratitude, which says a lot about you, right? Because I think you have a very special position as a psychiatrist that you sort of see many different lives and how they turn out, and you have this unique window to people's stories. And I, to a degree, have something similar in my life, and I'm very grateful sometimes to just the things that we take for granted, such as
Yes.
having people who believe in us, or having a stable environment, or love, or all these things that we don't think about in our childhood years, but they are, if the absence of them is felt, destroys the character of a person. Could you tell us a
Yes.
little bit more about, though, like early signs that indicated that you would go on the journey that you ultimately ended up going on?
Yeah. I don't know if there were a lot of early signs. I mean, I grew up
One
in
moment, one
the
moment,
United
sorry.
States, and
There were cleaning ladies. Let me go. Oh, yikes. Okay, now we are back. This is an original podcast, not CNN. So for the people,
That's all
okay,
right, so we can,
enters me.
yeah. Um, I'm not sure it is entirely evident where I was going to go when I was younger. I was raised in central New Jersey in the United States, in circumstances that were, there were family around and grandparents, extended family on both sides. And I had a lot of curiosity about the world around me, and I was good academically. So I guess if there were any harbingers of future academic achievements, it's that the academic part was very important to me. I think I had a lot of anxiety as a kid, and I wanted to perform well, and that's part of how approval came my way. And I think there are good aspects of that it's helped me stay conscientious and stay striving and achieving as I've gotten older. I think some of the anxiety about performing and making people happy and gaining approval, this stuff can kind of always cut both ways in terms of our self-image and self-esteem. But ultimately, I think that maybe conscientiousness, a drive, and an academic inclination, if you're going to look for early signs that I would end up going to medical school or doing some of the things I've done, it would probably be in those things, I think.
Mhm. Who do you think had the biggest impact on you growing up? Because one of the very reasons why actually, it's funny that you had this interview with Tim Ferriss, because he was the first person who inspired me to do this, and he kind of the person who introduced me to the idea that every person who you assemble around yourself is a vote for the kind of person that you could later on could possibly become. But in the beginning of our childhood, we don't have so much of a say-so of who we are with, and it's like either a blessing or a curse for that matter. In regards to your own journey of becoming Paul, like who had a particularly strong influence on you? Could be better or worse.
Definitely my maternal grandmother. When you ask that question, she springs to mind immediately. I mean, she was just a very loving, caring person, and the love came from her unconditionally. She wasn't nice to some people and not nice to others, and she was just universally supportive. And I think I took from that how much joy there is in living life that way. She was a very, very happy person despite having had difficult things in her own life, and was just liked by everyone because she was kind to everyone, right? And so much of that, I think, was lavished on me when I was a kid. And then as I have gotten older, some of that I think some people, or me at least, have suppressed a little bit, because when we're striving and life is difficult, right, and we're trying to get ahead, and it can bring a lot of conflict into our lives, that I'm not saying that entirely left me, but as I come to a stage of life where I'm in my early 50s and I have young children, now I gravitate more and more back to that way of being in life. And you talk about gratitude. I think my grandmother felt tremendous gratitude. I mean, she talked very little about the things that were negative. She was just focused. I think her whole being was focused on the things that were good, and she felt grateful. And I think if we feel grateful, it's an expression that there's an excess of goodness in us, that like I don't need all the goodness I have, so I can give some away to someone else, whether it's through a smile or it's through a kind act. And I think as I get further along in life, I come more and more back to those principles of how to be in the world. And I think she's the role model for just how to be a person.
Thank you for sharing that. That's actually something that while preparing for this podcast that struck me about you is that it's been a while that when I listen to interviews that I hear so much gentleness in the voice of a person, which surprised me, because from afar, like if you're somebody who is ambitious as well, you can see that there must be like a strong motor behind you, a strong urge, like a strong compulsion, maybe even an obsession to help others, but also to climb the hierarchy that you choose for yourself. Climb. Was there a time maybe in your life where this didn't come as easy to you as it is coming now, maybe in regards to finding harmony between getting ahead in life, but also being grateful for the things that are around you right now? Because I think that's always difficult, because in order to move, you need to feel like a strong sense of discomfort with who you are and what's around you. But it's kind of a weird dance. I'm not sure if I'm blabbling or if what I'm saying makes any sense to you.
No, I think it absolutely does. That when people really get ahead, there's a drive in them almost always, right? And the drive often has an other directedness, like, for example, a drive to help people, right? But the drive also has a self-referential aspect too. And I was a person who didn't like that things might be close to me, whether it was knowledge or interesting things in the world, social settings. And a lot of my striving was to sort of feel good enough in the world around me and feel like I could navigate the world around me and that things weren't closed off to me. And I think a combination of that kind of drive and some of the trauma, after the death of my brother when I was in my early 20s, that there were times when the drive maybe to some degree got the better of me. And I had a lot of periods of time with at least mild depression, a lot of anxiety, and even some bitterness, bitterness that the world was so hard to get ahead in, and so much was demanded of one. And the world doesn't pay enough attention to the impact of trauma or grief or even the need for sleep. As someone who trained when there were still 36-hour sessions of work, right? And you'd leave work sometimes 40 hours after showing up, and and I think it can take away from us some of that excess of goodness that says, hey, I can give some of this away. And even if we're striving for good things or to achieve good things that involve others, I think we can get pretty closed down when we just sort of feel beleaguered by the world. And I've had a lot of periods like that, and periods that involved, I think, a fair amount of depression as well.
Would you be comfortable with, like, for the people who this is the first time they listen to you, because there will be some, you just mentioned your brother. Would you be willing to speak a little bit about that? Because that's like one of the things why this might be one of the challenging interviews that I ever did in my life, is because like my brother is very, like, he was always my hero, and he became very depressed, and he hasn't talked to our family in like 5 or 6 years in a way. So hearing about your story, kind of reminded me of why I'm so like driven to leave an impact, particularly in the mental health dimension away. So maybe if you would feel comfortable enough with speaking about that chapter of your life, I think that would be a great help for others, to tell them how you cope with it, but also what happened. If not, that's of course completely fine as well.
Sure. No, thank you. I appreciate you asking in that way. And I'm okay with talking about it. Thank you. And I'm sorry for the difficult situation that you commented on in your own life. It's often traumas that can drive us to make a difference in the world. And I think why does the drive at times arise from trauma if we're fortunate enough to be able to work our way to the other side of it, right? And I know that's part of what our conversation will be about, is how trauma impacts us. How do we navigate beyond it? But I think sometimes the shock of really acute traumas, can give us a sort of different worldview. I did not have major trauma in my life until my mid 20s, when my youngest brother died by suicide. He was 20 years old at the time. So I had the benefit of the foundational aspects of tolerating distress, feeling some sense of security in myself, the things that happen when we have a stable early childhood, right? But then this huge trauma fell on top of that. And in addition to the sadness and grief and a lot of real despair to navigate, it also interestingly wiped away a lot of the insecurities I felt. So at the time, I had a job in the business world in New York, and I was doing well. I was doing well for someone in my demographic, and felt like I couldn't really leave or change that. So I had an interest in learning more things, in going back to school, and maybe becoming a doctor. No one in my family had been to medical school, and I wanted to learn and explore, but really thought that I couldn't, right? How could I leave this good job? And I was earning a good salary, and I was planning for my future. And wouldn't people be disappointed in me if I left the job? And then I was going to go back to school and not, earn a decent salary for 10 years, between all the schooling. And there were so many reasons why I, quote unquote, couldn't go and do what it was that I had in me, a mind to do. And it became just so much less important, after his death. I thought, what am I stopping myself for? And I was also able to see that I was depressed then, and I was drinking too much, and I was just miserable, right? And it's not that there was anything wrong with what I was doing. I just wasn't happy. I wanted to explore and learn more and do something more directly involving other people. And yes, there was a huge weight of grief and despair after my brother's death, but there was also a lifting of a lot of the shoulds or musts or can'ts, that had me really trapped in my early 20s. I mean, it's interesting to look back now from my early 50s and see how much I thought like 6 months of time would mean. I can't even switch jobs. I'll be 6 months behind. And how could I go back to medical school? I'm 5 years behind. Or, whatever it was that was going on in my head, I felt so much pressure. And I see that a lot in people where, we inadvertently oppress ourselves with all the shoulds and musts, that are inside of us. So it was awful in many ways, his death, but it was also liberating in other ways. And it let me say, hey, if I think I want to go become a doctor, and I've got it in me to try, why not? And that was a very different internal dialogue than I'd had before.
It's very strange in a way that adversity strips us of the inessential, isn't it? In a way, at least this is how it felt to me.
Great way to put it. Yes.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you is, the psychotic world seems somewhat in turmoil about not only what happened to your brother, but what depression is in general. And I found it very interesting that in what you shared with us right now is that you implemented elements of narratives and stories in a way that you, for example, shared. I didn't feel it was possible for me, or that I was allowed to re-enter medical school or pursue the other passions that you have, which is the definition of in Germany, like the origins of the word trauma. It's very interesting. In Germany, the word Traum, which is traumatized in Germany, means a dream, basically. And I'm wondering if you see some narrative elements or story elements in regards to depression, where the person basically is stuck in a nightmare or in a story that isn't serving them in a way, or did I misinterpret it into what you just said?
No, I think, and I think you really got it spot on, right? That yes, we have narratives inside of us, and a lot of times the work that I do, not always, but a lot of times we talk in therapy about people's narratives, right? Because we often don't stop and think, like, what am I telling myself about myself? Right? What is my narrative of self? And does it oppress me? Does it restrict me? Right? Does it empower me? right? And very often what will happen, especially in the context of traumas, big or small, is they start to impact our narrative, right? And they start to impact our feelings of what we can do, what we're allowed to do, even in mythical ways. People who feel cursed by God, or they feel, oh, fate will never give me anything good. And then we have these impressions of ourselves that can be very, very deterministic. So if a person feels like, hey, good things are off limits to me, right? Like I don't get good things. I don't get to have that in my life, or I'm not good enough for that, or no one thinks I'm good enough for that. Then we create self-fulfilling prophecies, right? We don't strive, right? We limit ourselves. Our breadth of perspective of the world goes down. Our enjoyment in human interactions goes down. We bring less of that, pleasant, grateful self to the world around us, and then our world can start to close in on us, right? It can start to be less broad and more repetitive, right? And from that boredom and that sadness, and often that sense of hopelessness and helplessness, can both arise depression, and depression, in the neurochemical changes it makes in our brains, can then promote that view of the world. So we can get into a vicious cycle where we feel very badly about ourselves, where we have a very negative life narrative that promotes biochemical changes towards depression and or heightened anxiety. And then the changes towards depression and anxiety then go back and further that negative narrative, right? Like, see, I know it's 6 months more and I don't have any friends and no one likes me. But if during those 6 months I've stayed inside, because I feel like no one will like me, and so I don't go outside, that's, there's a reflexive, aspect of that occurs in many, many people. I don't think that that's like some esoteric or rare thing when we revisit narratives, especially narratives in the context of trauma. It is often very surprising to the person what their own narrative is, even though that may be running over and over again in their mind, hundreds of times, or even as a background throughout the day, or it's running around when they're sleeping and it's informing their dreams. And we can be dominated by narratives that we've never actually decided are true.
Mhm. Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from Carl Jung. He said the most important question anybody could ever ask themselves is, what myth am I living? In a way. I
Yes.
found that so interesting, but also so challenging, because it's not precisely obvious what kind of story you find yourself engulfed in. And that was particularly surprising to me when I talked, for example, to people who were in dependent relationships with very narcissistic or like malevolent individuals, where they didn't notice that there were a sub-player in that kind of tragedy in a way. If you could go, like, what do you feel is a commonality among the stories that govern individuals who ultimately end up ending themselves prematurely?
I'll answer. I wanted to say, if I could say very quickly, a lot of times why the narratives don't shift in us and we're not aware of them is because it's very different when something's just running around in our brains than it is to put words to it and say it, right? There are a whole different set of brain mechanisms that assess what I'm saying, right? Like, what am I saying? Do I really believe that? Is that rational? Is it real? Is it true? I'll do much more of that if I'm speaking to you, right? It runs through different parts of the brain when we're creating speech, when we know that someone else is going to listen to that speech, right? It's different than the sort of unfettered negativity that can just run around inside of us. So it's a reason that it's so important to put words, whether it's a written word or it's the spoken word, to the narratives inside of us. And people who end their lives prematurely so often have narratives inside that get progressively more and more sort of closed in and claustrophobic, right? Progressively more negative. So the thoughts about hopelessness go from, well, I can't make my way in the broader world, to, I can't make my way 10 feet outside of my front door, or I can't make my way with the people inside the front door, right? We become more lonely and more closed off, and more taken away from the goodness that can be in the world around us. And if we're if we separate ourselves from that, there's not only no chance to receive goodness, right? Someone's approving smile, someone's positive comment, right? But there's
Mm.
less chance to give it, right? And again, I come back to this theme that when we can do good things, when we can interact with someone, like, if we're walking together or we're walking in different directions and I don't know you and you stumble and I can, put out a hand, or the things that show us and tell us that there is goodness in us, there is hope in us. And it's the isolation. And oftentimes people are very isolated inside, even if they're with other people, right? It's the isolation inside that I think more and more brings to the surface a sense of despair and hopelessness and lack of self-worth. Like, I don't matter. I mean, what does I don't matter mean? Or don't make any difference, or the world will be better if I'm not here. A person who's saying that or feeling that doesn't have access to the goodness inside of themselves, right? Which is why very often that's what we're trying to do, or try to help someone do who's feeling very suicidal, is to help that person realize that they can impact the world in a positive way. I've often thought, if when a person is so depressed, if we could wave a magic wand, that they just appeared, in a refugee camp somewhere, somewhere where they're just surrounded by people in need, right? Then they would be able to do things for those people, right? And I think that would be the most rapid way to get a person to feel differently. It's not giving them something, right? It's showing them that they have something to give.
Yeah, it's a beautiful notion, very unorthodox for the psychotic world, though, in a way, because I feel that in the psychotic system that we have right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's more about helping the person, fixing the person, diagnosing the person, and then treating the symptoms that they have, rather than helping that particular person to take their part in the world and helping them to help others. And one of my favorite stories that there always comes to mind is from my favorite therapist, Viktor Frankl, when he was
Mhm,
in
mhm.
Auschwitz, right?
Yes,
And he was
yes,
talking people out of suicide there. And
yes.
there was this one geologist, for whatever reason, the story stuck with me, but he was very, very desperate. And Victor came to him, and the geologist said, like, I have nothing to expect out of life anymore. And Victor turned the question and said, like, could it not be that life is expecting something out of you? And then they
Mm,
talked about, like, hey, you
mhm.
have this book about geology that you didn't finish. Maybe you would be reunited with your camps. Like, there's this shift of
Yes,
perspective. I found that very inspiring in a way.
yes,
Um, if
yes.
you could travel back in time, Paul, and talk to that 20-year-old version of yourself stuck in a situation of ultimate adversity, what would be maybe something that you would say to you, or maybe provide you with an item, story, a technique, or something maybe doesn't even have to be words that would help you to endure the storm that was in front of you as nobly as possible?
I think it would be that if a person is fortunate to be healthy enough to have some good core values, right? Like, I want to work hard. I want to leave the world at least a little bit better than I found it, today, tomorrow, and across the lifespan. So good work, fairness, diligence, perseverance, that those are the ingredients for happiness. I mean, I have taken care of people in every imaginable socioeconomic demographic, and there's a commonality. And it's not like, oh, some factor of privilege, for example, is skews people towards being happier and healthier, right? It is not that, right? It's the sense, it's the sense of being grounded to the values of basic humanness, right? Of working hard, being fair to people, um, um, trying to make life better, right? That makes us happy. It's not that we need to achieve some certain thing as an end in itself, right? And I think I thought if I had more knowledge, like, oh, knowledge would make me happier, or more approval, right? I have a medical degree and now I'm a doctor, and like, I'll feel better about myself, I'll feel safer, I'll feel less vulnerable. And what I've learned over the years is it's just not that, which isn't, it's not a statement of that's against striving, right? But realizing, what does the striving get us. I mean, the tangible aspects of my strivings have meant far less to me than the ability to interact with good people and be mutual with them, like sit down with people in a room and try and help them, right? Or sometimes be helped by them, right? That there's a common humanness that is outside of our culture. Like, I mean, think about how we live as humans today. I mean, it's like a millisecond, on the, if you looked at like the clock of human history, right? So,
Mm.
so if we ground to principles that are true across the human experience, across cultures, across time periods, right? We see that that's where people have a sense of really of rightness, so to speak, with being alive. Like, I'm alive, and it brings a lot of stress and a lot of difficulty and a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. But you know what? It's okay. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to make things better. There are good people around me. In a sense, I'm attracted to and attract good people if I'm trying to be that, right? When a person has that feeling, I think that person feels good and feels whole, even if there is adversity, which maybe actually I hadn't thought of, as it brings back to my grandmother, who I think had that feeling. And then I think like life was okay because like she could always do something to make life a little better for someone each day. And I think she felt her place in the world that way. And that equated to happiness. And I think whether one is really driven and striving, it may actually be even more important if one is driven and striving, because as you said, there are then situations we can encounter that run the risk of embittering us, right? Where there's like, there's arduous mountains to climb, right, to get ahead, and interpersonal difficulties, right? Because there are people, I think most of whom are impacted by trauma, who can be very malicious, as you said, very malevolent, right? And we encounter that too in the world around us. And there's almost a temptation, like there's a seduction to cynicism, that I'll be safer if I'm cynical, right? And I felt that throughout much of my life, and I'm protected from having expectations that I might be disappointed in, right? And I'll protect myself better against the subset of people who are malevolent. And look, maybe that's true, but that doesn't make life better. It doesn't make life happier.
Mhm. Very, very interesting. Before I move on with the investigation of your spectacular life, in regards to this topic, because I know you've talked about this a couple of times in a way, and by much better interviewers than I am, what do you feel is a question that should have been asked or addressed towards you but wasn't?
Do you mean an earlier stage of life or after the loss of my brother?
In regards to the chapter of where that with your brother happened, but in your early 20s, because I feel this was a pattern that you were courageous enough to talk in a couple of other interviews, even though many people, many thousands, I think more than a million people listen to those stories. So that for me, that's a sign of courage and faith that it's worth like opening up so that others can be helped. And my question was, in regards to this chapter, what do you feel was a question that wasn't been asked?
I see. Yes.
But should have been asked, if you think about it in a way, because there's you can tell a story in a way, but there's always maybe a question that would reveal a more useful truth to the audience. Anything that would come to mind that would be helpful, that you would ask yourself this question. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense.
Yeah, no, I do think that makes sense. And again, I hadn't thought of it before, but I think the question I would ask is how do you want to be, right? Not what do you want to be, right? Because things were so tangible then. As a person who wanted to get ahead and have a stable life and have achievement and be successful, right? There was so much thought of like, what am I going to be? And then I just pictured things, right? Like I pictured me as a very successful businessman, or me as a scientist, or me as a doctor, or me at that point as a husband in a family, me as a father. And there's a level, what do you want to be? But that's hollow. As I think about that now, I just have like kind of two-dimensional stick images, in my mind as I say those things, because what one wants to be doesn't tell you anything about how you want to be. And I think if I had been focused more on how do I want to be, then I probably would have made aspects of my own life easier or better. I wouldn't have thought like, well, I'm not going to be okay or safe unless like I make this much money and live in this kind of place and have this kind of respect from the world around me. And I think so much of that are efforts to just stave off vulnerability, right? Because then we're detached from how we really want to be. If you know how you want to be, it's easier to get there, right? Apply your values and strive towards the thing that you're interested in, right? As opposed to trying to back into happiness by becoming something, right? And I think that was a problem for me. And I think it's a problem for a lot of young people, sometimes for people who are not so young, right? Of thinking more about the mechanics of it and the box checking of life, as opposed to like, how do I want to live? And again, I don't think that's some pie in the sky, like we have to make our way in the world and, you know, we have to be able to support ourselves and all of that. There are a lot of ways to do that. And I think we'd be so much more successful if we thought about how do I want to do it? What makes me feel good? What even at that stage of life, what influences in my life, you know, made me feel good about myself and helped me make others feel good about themselves. I think I would have felt much more grounded and much less sort of goal driven without really knowing what the goals meant. And I think that's caused me a lot of problems until, as you said, that, you know, how tribulation can sort of wash away our, you know, our presumptions about life. It would have helped me to have more of that kind of insight before the loss of my brother.
Mm. Would that be part of the message that you would like to convey to people who are right now in that age? So ask themselves not only what they want to be, but how do they want to be?
Yes. Yes. And I
Okay.
think that anchors to life as the person has known it, right? Because that's an invitation, right? To say, hey, think about your life, right? And I am so struck by, just as I think you were talking about how like the modern world of medicine and mental health care works. And the analogy I use so often is like polishing the hood when there's something to really look at and solve in the engine. Right. And I think that concept extends across our society, even how we treat, for example, our infrastructure, right? We say, well, we shore something up here and there, and we don't look at how we have to replace bridges and roads and, you know, and protect against floods and the kind of natural disasters we've had. We tend to do a lot of polishing the hood instead of looking in the engine. And we even do that about our own lives, right? So a lot of time when someone comes in to do work together, to do therapy, we're talking about their life in a level of depth they don't often think about. Right? Well, I had this person, that person. You know, people talk about their lives as if, you know, they're telling a sort of a grocery list of things, right? And a lot of times that's how it is in our head, instead of saying, well, what made you feel a certain way? What made you feel excited? And what made you feel like, you know, ambitious in a good way? Like, I want to know, I want to learn. I feel, you know, I feel an abundance of possibility inside of myself. Like, who made you feel that way? Who made you feel the opposite? You know, what kind of things have resonated one way versus the other? It's a getting a feel for who we are. And, you know, we just don't do that often enough. So yes, in the how do you want to be question is also there an invitation and maybe even an entreaty, right? To look at your life and what generates meaning in it.
You've spoken a lot about values, and I've listened to an interview of Jordan Peterson recently, and he said that one of the most severe threats that our generation is facing is the loss of values, in a way, through the collapse of old institutions such as religious institutions, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel is something we've lost as a culture in regards to knowledge about ourselves that was useful and that helped previous generation to preserve their sanity, that maybe the younger generation that we are right now doesn't have anymore, with the radical scientific but also technological advancement, because so many things are changing, and it feels to me too a little bit like we severed the connection that we had with our past. Anything to mind that comes to that?
Yeah, I think that we have become very unanchored from the basics of what human history really has taught us. So if you think about, for example, religion, right? There are obviously many different religions in the world, but the religions often share basic values, right? Just values of fairness, values of kindness. They're at the heart of so many religions. These are the major religions in the world around us, but we become detached, severed from that, and then the enaction of the religion of the person's values can come through a very different lens, through a persecutory lens, right? Through a lens that really is more about self. So, for example, in America, my understanding of say Christianity, right? Just take an example of a religion and one that's prominent in America, is that there's such a grounding in kindness, acceptance. Like if I disagree with you, and even if I feel like you've harmed me, right? Can I still find it in my heart to be fair and reasonable to you? Right? Because that's the right way to behave towards you. And as proof of that, it's the right way to behave towards me too. Right? That ultimately my own life is better and happier, and that when we're assailing one another, it doesn't bring anything good. So the basic values of our religious traditions tell us that, right? But you'll see in America where people are coming at, through a religious lens, it becomes persecutory. Right? We're saying, well, no, we don't want that person around here if their sexuality isn't what we agree with, right? We being the narrow lens of the religion, or, if their gender identity isn't what we agree with, or the political values. And you see, like, there was a big thing in not that long ago of certain Christian schools saying people who are gay can't teach. Right? It's like, that's not the value system of the religion. The value system is one of acceptance, whether one agrees or disagrees. It's not one of saying to someone, hey, you don't belong, right? I mean, are we promoting depression, misery, dysfunction, suicide, right? By telling people you're less than and you don't belong? Like, I think we do promote those things when we tell people, when we give people that message. But often the religious lens gets hijacked and it gets used for that. Right. So it's just one example where I think there's some very basic lessons that history tells us, right? Like when people are destructive, like good things don't come of it, right? Lots of people die. It makes destruction all over. Like how many times have we seen that? It's a basic lesson of human history. Like, can we try not to fight or to be more reasonable? Because usually when we're fighting, things end up bad, and if we saw like the truth of that, if we grounded to the traditions in our major, so that the values in our major religious traditions, things that science and medicine tell us that we're going to talk about in this, in this time together, of how trauma impacts and alters our brain function, right? It's not an esoteric or a bleeding heart kind of concept, right? There's medical proof of change in the brain, right? So if we ground it to the basic lessons of history, religion, science and medicine, and even early childhood education. And I think that's where I would really hang my hat on the answer to your question, that so many times I see people in positions of public import, right? So politicians, leaders in various ways, behaving in a manner that would get, your parents will get called in kindergarten, right? Like, it's not okay to behave that way, but yet somehow it's okay to behave that way once we get to a bigger stage, right? And I think that so promotes cynicism, right? The idea that, hey, we're really out for ourselves. And once we're in a position of power, like if I'm in a position of power, I'm going to say what serves me, whether it's right or wrong, right? And if you and I disagree, I'm going to attack you, because if I do that, I'm more likely to get my way. Like, these aren't our values, right? Right? This is not what we were taught in kindergarten. Yet somehow it's okay to enact a different way of interacting with the world. And I think our basic values are there. They're obvious, they're in front of us, but we become detached from them. And I think a lot of that is through the lens of trauma. People who are desperate for life to be different in some way. I think we see a lot of that in the United States with people who are disenfranchised. Before the pandemic, there was news saying, oh, the economy is doing great, right? Because unemployment is so low. But when you looked a little further, some huge percentage of people, like half or more, wouldn't be able to stay afloat if they had like an unexpected, like $700 expense, right? So that breeds desperation in people. It breeds a sense of like, I'm doing what I can do, but I don't have security. I have vulnerability. And what if I get sick, right? Or what if my child gets sick? And it breeds a desperation that makes people open to the kind of divisive politics we've seen, right? To say, well, we'll give you something to lie around. and maybe that's someone thinking, their gender or their race or their religion, whatever, is superior. Right? Let's ally around that, and people are much more likely to accept that and to be in favor of that when they feel a sense of desperation. Right? I mean, we know that. That's how cults target people. Like we know that, right? So if we have entire demographics of people who don't feel they can get ahead in life, that they can make life better, or even that they can protect or take care of their families and their children, they're going to be very vulnerable to extremism. For example, I mean, we just see this across the world because we're not helping people understand themselves. We're not helping them be able to take what's inside of them and make their lives better. In other words, we're not holding out something better than what, say, extremism may bring and offer to people, and of course a false way, but that false way becomes appealing when people are desperate. And I think it's all tied together, right? That if there's no excess of goodness in us to give away, then we're going to be very hard and very difficult and very aggressive with one another. Right. And then that leads to then a you versus me kind of cynicism. And then it makes it more likely to ally around things that don't make any sense to actually ally around. They're not value systems. It's like a skin color, right? Makes no sense. But people will do that from the perspective of desperation. And if we don't make the world a better place that's grounded to the actual values that our history and religion and early childhood education teach us, then that goes up through the society and we create more aggression, more divisiveness. And, I don't think that's alarmist. I mean, I think if you look at the state of the world, and certainly the state where the United States is at now, we see that's what's happened. Right? We've progressively gotten further afield till we're in a place now where entire systems of endeavor, let alone individual people, are completely untethered to basic values.
Interesting. Isn't it fascinating that psychology and the developments of a society go hand in hand in a way? I think that's a lesson that many Germans, like everybody in Germany knows, for example, that one of the consequences of group resentment is the destruction of society in a way, because that's what happened here in a way. So everybody here is very uneasy by the fact that war has come to our neighbors, not only because we are worried for our own safety, but because we also can look a little bit into the future and see, oh boy, like all those millions of people, like it's not like their emotions will go away tomorrow and they will be happy for what happened in a way, like all the grudges that they would have, all the traumas, all the families that destructed. Like you are one of the persons with the deepest insights about the human condition. Where do you feel we go as the world? Is there any kind of prophecy that you could make in regards to things that alarm you or things that you see could potentially happen to us?
I think we need to embrace that culture is the sociological expression of free will, right? That we as groups of humans create cultures, and those cultures can be heartless and persecutory, right? Or those cultures can be kind and generative, right? To create goodness and make things better. And that we're responsible for our contribution to culture. If culture is the sociological equivalent of individual free will, then our free wills, right, together create culture. And no one of us can dominate or create the culture on our own. But what we can do is take a stand, right? And to say, look, I'm not going to participate in things that are not right, even if they benefit me in some way, right? There are people who have been so reprehensible in our political system that if their entire political agenda were to make my life better, make Paul Conti's life better, I would vote against them. Right? Because I don't, if there's something good for me, you could say, oh, am I being altruistic? Is that like grandstanding? Right? No, actually, I don't think that's good. If I voted yes, and then people are in power who just want my life to be better, well, like others are going to oppose that. Like, is that really good even for me, let alone for everyone else? Right? And I think we have to take responsibility for that. And as a person who's very interested in the world around me and has done a lot of traveling and exploration of different cultures, I have found Germany and Germans to be so much more attuned, because the history of the Second World War is so much more present in a way that I think leads people to be more circumspect, to understand and appreciate more. It's like, of course, it's been said so many times that if we don't understand the lessons of history, we will repeat them. Right. And I worry that in places that are more distant from that, where, most Americans don't know anything about the Second World War. You see the quizzes, like ask X number of people, even who was fighting and who was almost like people don't know. Right. So we can't remember the lessons of, we can't use the lessons of history to protect ourselves and to guide ourselves into the future if we don't remember them. And I think having a circumspection about what's gone on, because look, there's tribulation and persecution in just every country I'm aware of, right? I mean, that maybe that's not true in places like Bhutan, who is, the happiness index, I don't know, right? But there's so much for us to look at in any Western nation of like, how do we treat people? How have we treated people? Not so much, not to make us feel a sense of guilt, right? But to make us feel a sense of responsibility for the present, right? And I so often wish that we could do more of that here, right? Instead of like, well, now is now, and I want what I want now, right? Or I want what I want for me or my group now, right? As opposed to looking and saying, hey, there are lessons of history, just like there are lessons of the religious principles in the early education that tell us that we lead ourselves to disaster then, and that disaster has deep psychological and emotional wounds over time. I think this is probably a good time for me to cite, I interviewed two chapters in my book, are interviews of people who I think are speaking to exactly this. And one of them is a German, right, Stephanie von Gutenberg, who is a child rights advocate. And I interview Stephanie in the book, where she talks about the impact. You talk about child abuse, and so it's an aspect, if you say emotions and pain and trauma last over generations, right? And so she writes about that from the perspective of what happens in children and how children are impacted. And then on the other end of the spectrum, Darren Richarder, who's a professor of psychiatry at Stanford, talks about trauma across generations, that, a trauma today isn't quote unquote just something that happened today, but it's something that can impact that person so deeply that it impacts how they pass on their genes years later. So think about that in terms of like the truth, the hard science of what trauma does inside of us and how it lasts across generations, that we know from epigenetic data that acute trauma. So for example, rape as a tool of war, right, which was seen as like it's a crime that was committed on a certain day in a certain place, and it was sort of viewed that way, right, as opposed to viewing that as something that's changed someone's life forever, right, and that changes even the lives, the gene expression, the very creation of human beings who aren't even conceived of yet, who could be conceived of years down the road. So I think you're right that trauma has a very, very long reach, and the earlier it starts, i.e. childhood, right, the deeper it goes, and the more that we spread it around us, the more it extends into the future. And there's like real scientific data about that tells us if we're going to guide ourselves into the future, we have to look at what we're doing now and what it means in the future. As you said, all those millions of people, and how many of them, children who've lost parents, parents who've lost children, people who've lost siblings. I mean, we know so and we could go on and on about what that trauma means. And guess how long that trauma is going to affect the world? Forever, right? Forever, because it will impact gene transmission forever. And if we're fortunate and we apply resources and we do the right things, maybe we can attenuate that. But just like the impact of slavery in the United States, the impact of the Second World War, right? You say, well, how long does that impact last? Well, the answer is forever, right? So we might want to determine our culture, right, our sociological free will in ways that don't spread eternal trauma, right, and look at ways that we can be more grounded to the basic values that prevent trauma.
That was a super interesting point. Please keep that for a second. I will just get something for a second, and I have a question about generational trauma. This will be just a 10-second break, okay? Stay
Sure.
with me here.
Yeah.
One moment.
Sure.
Don't worry, cut this out. Okay. So, okay, we are back. Thank you so much for sharing that about generational trauma, because that was to ask you. And while you talked, I noticed something interesting. Maybe it's only interesting to me. In Germany, wherever you go, you will find a war memorial that basically reminds you of the lessons of the past, so we don't repeat them. And I wanted to ask you if you see some commonalities in regards to solving of personal trauma and collective trauma in that regards, into the idea of maybe Germans are less haunted by their past because they have extracted the wisdom of what happened in a way. Because one of the things as an European is very strange to me, for example, is that the American socio-cultural structure in a way seems to be very stuck at something that happened a couple of 100 years ago, as something traumatized you as an individual, and you keep fighting that same battle over and over again. And I wanted to ask you if you see like a commonality in regards to that, particularly in regards to the like one of the buzz topics right now is like white privilege and critical race theory. Like what's your take on that, and what would be your, if you would be maybe voted into a little group of elders who would reshape society in that way, like how would you address that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the fact that there are, as you said, anywhere you go in Germany, you see a memorial like you described, I think is immensely important. And what it says to me is that people can acknowledge, okay, something bad has happened, right? And I can acknowledge that and what it means without a sense of personal shame, right? I think that very much what you hear in America is, hey, it wasn't my fault. Like, my ancestors weren't even here, or, I never participated in any of that. I mean, I've only been alive since 19X, and there's a sense of personal shame, right? Which sends a very bad message, right? It sends a message that things that are negative, things that are traumatic, warrant being shoved under the rug, right? And because the reflex in us to trauma, to our own personal trauma, is a reflex of guilt and shame that leads us to hide it away, right? Like that's a big theme that runs throughout the book that I wrote, that trauma creates a reflex of guilt and shame, and the guilt and shame leads us to want to hide things away, right? So that would, if that were followed, there wouldn't be memorials around, right? But that's would be very negative, right? Because then the reflex of guilt and shame that says, oh, just don't look at that, right? Like we can't think about that, we can acknowledge that, right? Sends other messages too, that like that's what to do with all trauma, what to do with all that's negative, right? And then the things in myself to process, right, then get ignored, right? As opposed to acknowledging that, yes, like bad things have happened. Like maybe I wasn't here and I didn't do them, right? But like I live here now, right? So if I live here and as a citizen, can I think of the questions that are asked through the lens of equality? Like I wasn't around during the Civil War, right? But I'm an American, right? So as a citizen of this country, can I look at things that happened here that were negative and say, well, what does it mean? Right? What happened subsequent to that, right? Did you have a group of people who were treated as less than for so long that opportunities were less than they should have been? And then there are ways that we might want to make amends for that, right? Whatever that may mean. Like it's a way of looking at things separated from the personal guilt and shame. And I think, again, there's a parallel between the personal and the sociological, right? So if culture is the sociological expression of free will, then the culture of having memorials that in Germany that acknowledge the Second World War is an extension of a personal. I think I see that as an extension of a personal set of choices that that say like, right, like, you know what, things that are good and bad happen everywhere, and things that are good and bad happen in me, right? So maybe that thing I did yesterday that I feel kind of lousy about, instead of just ignoring that, I can acknowledge it. Maybe I can make amends, right? Maybe I can find some goodness in me to right some wrong. And I think if we're doing that on a personal level, it's much easier to do it on a sociological level. And if the society is engendering that, then it's easier to do it on a personal level. Now, of course, there are other factors involved too, but the culture of hide it away, wasn't me, I wasn't there, right? Like that's not good for the society, say in America, right? And it's also not good for individuals because it sends a message of anything negative in you is not something to look at and face or work through or make amends or apologize for, God knows what, right? But it's just shove it under the surface, and then guilt and shame and negativity fester, right? So it's trauma promoting to hide all that away.
It's a strange cycle, isn't it? Because it's I would agree with everything you just said, but also the emotions, that resentment on top of it, and the idea that cruelty eventually will grow out of the idea of adopting a victim's narrative in a way. Because one of the things that I found with a lot of people who kind of evolved themselves to the dark side was the idea that there were victims in regards to that the world did them wrong. And like one of the coping mechanisms of when injustice happens to you on the highest scale is that either you hide from it or you take revenge against it in a way. Mm-hmm. So it's, for me, from a personal level, I'm very worried about seeing these things as a person who's very much in love with America and has dreams about, that will be my next question, like about what it was like for you as a student to go to the places of such high prestige where some of the noblest ideas ever were born. But those are some things that as a European they worry us over here. And mm-hmm. I hope that we can do our part in solving them.
Yes.
I've noted that on a couple of your podcasts, you talked very much, and after that, I would like to talk with you about your experience as a psychiatrist in a way. But I found that you also had an extraordinary academical journey in a way. You have been to some of the most prestigious places in the world, Stanford, Harvard, now your own psychiatry. How did that came about? What is that adventure? How did that came about? What was it like for you?
It's interesting. You have me thinking about it.
Because I rarely heard you talk about it, but for me, it's that sounds like a book in itself. Like what happened there?
Well, I think, you'd ask that early question about like what childhood was like, right? And that anxiety in me, or that sense of vulnerability and like not wanting things to be closed from me, right? And wanting maybe the security that comes with a certain name, right, attached to your education, right? Like some of that I think is born from a legitimate curiosity of like, well, wow, what might there be to learn in this place, right? That seems so hallowed, places when I was a kid I couldn't imagine, like that generally there wasn't a whole like set of thoughts and ideas to strive for that kind of education. So I think there was a mystical aspect of it to me. Like, was there magic there to be had, right? But the other side of that coin is that closed off to me because in some ways I'm less than, because I'm not from, I don't know, the social class that goes to those places, or, those are ideas I had in my head when I was younger. So I think some of that striving really comes from a place of wanting to learn the most, be the best, in a good way that would enable me to do more good in the world. And some of it also comes from a place, I think, of insecurity, of saying, well, I don't want that door to be closed to me because I'll feel less than, or I'll feel vulnerable. I mean, I think it's a combination of personal insecurity and, desire to really learn the best there is to learn out there if you're going to go try and do things. And for me, it was, if I'm going to go try and I'm going to be taking care of people, this thought of like being a doctor, which I had no idea. I mean, no one in my family was in medicine. I swear this is true. Before medical school, I had only been in a hospital to visit somebody sick. Like I knew nothing about it. So there was a perception of such an immense responsibility that like, oh, if you do it wrong, you can kill people. Like I absolutely remember thinking that, right? So I mean, I better bring my best self in every moment of it. And that included well, let me see, like get the quote unquote best education I can get. So I think a combination of that, that's very powerful, right? A combination of what we might say is generative, like I want to learn and do, right? And the other side of that coin, if I want to soothe my own insecurity, I think that could be a powerful combination, I guess.
Mhm. Very, very, very interesting. What do you think is the number one lesson you learned from being both at Stanford and as a different chapter in Harvard? Because it's, for me, that's quite fascinating that I think sometimes it appears like, I don't know, you get used to who you are in a way, but there are millions of people in the world who are maybe at the beginning of their journey, who have dreams about one day studying shoulder to shoulder with the most motivated, ambitious people in the world, but maybe also the most curious ones. What's something that those places gave you? Can be positive or negative, because I've had like multiple people from these Ivy League schools on my podcast, and there were some ambivalent takeaways from these schools. I would be curious, what were yours, if you feel like it would be worth sharing them, otherwise we move on.
Yeah, maybe I'll say in a kind of a quick comparison, because actually one thing stands out. This I have thought about before, or sometimes it's just asked about personally. And so I have a set of thoughts about this, which really are, I think that rigidity and the kind of expectations is to tell people like, here's what you're going to do, here's how you're going to do it, here's how you're going to behave. I find that all to be very negative. I mean, of course, you have to have rules of how to comport oneself, but when there's something hierarchical, rigidity and hierarchy, I think are not good for people's development and also just people's health and happiness. And I found much more of that on the East Coast, right? Because I think I went to 4 different East Coast schools too, when you add it all up. There's much more of that on the East Coast. And I think this ends up becoming me actually saying something very positive, I guess, about Stanford, because it was a very different feel. And I knew that when I chose to go there. It was, I mean, I got, I think, a great education there, but they sort of minimized the useless rigidity, the hazing of medical education, there's like 8 people in this hierarchy, right? And if you're number 7, you can be lousy to number 8, but you have to be subservient to number 6, like things that make no sense. And I think ultimately are trauma promoting, and the whole system of medical education, I think, is among the most trauma promoting systems one is going to find. So I think some freedom from that Stanford really felt, as a person who came from the East Coast, like we would think the openness of California, like, okay, like there's just more, it's sunny out, there's palm trees, and people are more flexible and just interested in what you think. And I really legitimately found that there. And I had then had a contact with really senior people, like Nobel Prize winners, like they were around us. They were interested in talking to us. I mean, the truth is I saw very, very little of that at Harvard, because it was a hierarchy, right? And as a trainee, I was at the bottom of it. Right. So, you're not interacting with people like that. Whereas there were times at Stanford where people like that would come seek us out. Right. Anything you want to talk about. Right. Hey, what's going on with you? And like that would happen there. And I have not seen that other places. And I think a lack of rigidity and hierarchy and an openness is so important to people, not just learning, but developing as humans, and also keeping their sanity during it. I mean, there's a lot of substance abuse, depression, suicide in physicians, right? The rates are much, much higher. And I think a lot of that is born of a system that is brutal, and that starts that brutality often, at the beginning of medical school. And I think there was aspects where Stanford was an exception, and I feel an eternal gratitude to the place for being that way.
If you would have a message to all freshman medical students, what would you say to them? If you could give them one piece of advice, maybe.
Let's see. I'm gonna pass along the advice of Dr. Rai Chowdhury, who, if somehow he's listening, he'll know, is him who described once that we were all just pea harvesters. That we had little hoes, and we were just harvesting passing grades so that we could move on to the next phase, right? And I think there really is a truth to that we get so lost in the competition and scores, and I think that makes no sense. I mean, once you're in medical school, right? Like, you don't have to compete and do better than the person next to you. Like, it's at some point there's not just diminishing returns, but that's harmful. And I remember that characterization that we're just harvesting peas. And when you harvest this peat, you go on to the next step. And that opened up. I mean, I remember that clear as day. First year of medical school, him saying that, and it opened up some space inside of me for things like sleep and better self-care. And I would absolutely say that to first year of medical. Harvest the peas, you'll get to where you want to go. Don't get as lost in all the details as the people around you maybe think you should. Because why? Because they're overly invested in things that don't matter.
Beautiful. How did you become a psychiatrist? Because that was a big shift in your life as well, right? It's like leaving the medical field and focusing more, or rather using what you've learned there to focus on being a doctor of the psyche in a way. How did that came about?
I had this real revelation that one could be a psychiatrist and be really grounded in the foundations of medicine. I mean, oftentimes there's a thought that psychiatry is a disjunction from the rest of medicine. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes it is, right? It can be less well-grounded. But in part, because neurobiology and brain science is so strong at Stanford, and it's so strong in the psychiatry department, that I realized that you can think about people like as a whole person, right? You can think about what's going on in that person's body. Do they have a thyroid problem, right? Do I see signs of a potential occult cancer and a brain metastasis, right? That you could think about people in the way that I think we should, as any specialized field of medicine, where you start as a generalist. You start thinking about that person from head to toe, and maybe you're ordering labs and studies, and you're thinking about the impact of other medical conditions. That you start there, and then you progressively, and then of course medicines, right? Like there's medicines aren't the be all and end all, but we have sophisticated medicine. So understanding the pharmacology, right? That you could progressively go down this route, starting with the whole person, and you could get to talking with them about the things that really most mattered to them. And, maybe ultimately helping them was, you got some guidance from that MRI or from those lab tests, and from, made a referral to another doctor, or you encourage that person to have the mammogram they haven't had in the last 5 years. And you did medical things. And as part of that, you help the person, you build a relationship, you understand them better. And then maybe you can get to the point of talking about the childhood trauma or the loss. And so this idea that you could bring all of your life perspective to bear, like I was very interested in, I still am, like in literature and travel and history, that all of this has its place in the field, but it's grounded within medicine, like being a physician. And boy, that, I think when the light bulb went off, I was like, oh, okay, it can be this way. Then that was a decision was made for me then.
Thank you for sharing that. It's always fascinating for me how people, you're always so unaware of where the journey of life will take you in a way. One moment you're there, you can never imagine that something else will happen to you, but then you found yourself in a different niche. What do you think was, and I have to give credit, this question is not from me, it's from one of my idols, Jeffrey Kotler, who is, I think, the best therapist in the world. And he wrote a book about therapists' finest hours, where they share particularly meaningful stories of their life, where the session they had or the way in which they helped had the superior sense of significance. Any story that comes to mind to you that stands out above others for any particular reasons?
Boy, I mean, I will say something specific, but I'll say in a general way, the stories that involve shared humanness. You referenced Viktor Frankl, who's really in many ways the father of existential psychotherapy, which is a view. I mean, it's complicated, but one aspect of it is that there's a shared truth, a shared reality between people. So the thought before that was that our interactions are transactional. Like I say something, I put it out there, you take it in, you process it, you put something out there, I take it in, right? There's an inherent separateness, right? Which I think is part of the psychodynamic tradition, which I very much respect, but I think kind of misses this point that the existential perspective has, again, I think starting with Viktor Frankl and how people were able to find meaning and survival is the shared humanness, the idea that if you're sitting with someone and there's mutual trust and it's a safe space, that humanness between the two of you can make a difference to the person you're trying to help, but then of course to the helping person too, right? And I think, it leads me to the story in the book I wrote, like 10 years, a person who's 10 years past when we met, who for all ability to see and assess is 10 years younger, right? And I think, a lot of how that change came about in her, and she and I have talked about it and talked about the story. She gave me permission to write and publish that story. It was really, we made a relationship of shared humanness, and we were able then to talk about things that were before then too hard to think about for her, let alone to talk about. And then that led to her really changing her life. And
for those who haven't read the book yet, could you maybe briefly tell that story, or is it too long?
Well, the basics would be a person who had a very, very terrible trauma in their life, and then the response of guilt and shame and avoidance meant the person never explored that trauma or its meaning, right, to her. And it led to a series of very negative life events, so that where the person's life was so much different and so much worse. And then of course that she had so many negative thoughts and feelings about herself, so much internal struggle amidst all the unprocessed grief of the loss from years and years ago. And the ability to see that trauma was every bit as impactful, on the day that we met as it was on day one for her. And that wasn't a reason for shame. It was just a natural humanness to have been impacted by it that way. And when we feel that way, it's easy not to make the best decisions. It's easy to be hateful towards ourselves and to make our lives a little worse, which leads to making life a little worse and a little more spite or self-abasement towards ourselves. And then we can end up in a bad place. And then in that way, we were talking about an hour ago, say, see, this is me. Right? The goodness that was in me before, like none of that was real. What's real is this badness, right? And the ability to see that, to have compassion for herself, to again find the truth of herself, the goodness, the striving, the giving, right? And the change it made in her life, so that for all intents and purposes, if you saw her or spend a little time with her, or saw a short video or something, and you saw, 10 years, and then you saw 10 years later, right? It looked like the 10 years later was the 10 years before, right? Because not just her physical health was better, but just, her affect and, the person she was in the world was indeed 10 years younger. And I think it shows the truth of what trauma can do to us in such a dramatic way, right? Such a dramatic way, how awful things became after unprocessed grief and guilt and shame and hiding it away, and how much better they became, even towards what looked like a reversal of time, right?
Yeah.
From being able to get back in touch with the core values of compassion, that like she had a right to grieve and a right to cry and a right to feel as sad and angry and frustrated.
What happened to her, if you might share? Because
Well,
I think one of the ways, like, in which people I feel can open up if they hear what happened to others, because maybe they would be useful. Or do you think that's too much?
I think it's okay, and I've communicated with her, but it's okay to say the detail that it's that she had lost a child.
What kind of difference, or maybe I ask this question afterwards, or maybe that's a good question right now. So different things traumatize us, right? And if you would name them on a hand, in a way, like what kind of life events do you think injure our narratives to the degree that we reoriented ourselves in a disempowering manner? You just said something like an unjust is maybe the wrong word, like a tragedy in itself, that is a meaningless tragedy in a way. Like what else have you found is like common sources of things that traumatize people?
Yeah. To set the stage for that question, I want to really emphasize that in the way that we're defining trauma here is something, and we'll talk about what the somethings could be, right, that impacts us by overwhelming our coping skills, often by terrifying us, but by overwhelming us, not always terrifying us, but that's one example. But our coping skills are overwhelmed, and then our brains are different going forward. And again, I think it's worth just pausing on that for a second, because we're talking about something that is rooted in hard science, right? That the modern neuroscience shows us this, that when a person is impacted by trauma in the way that we're defining trauma, overwhelming one's coping skills, then the brain is different going forward. So one example being the brain looks at novelty, at new people in a different way, right? It looks at new people much more as potential threats. Right? So think about it, that's not a good change. And it's one of so many changes where if you're meeting new people, instead of saying like, oh, like, could we get along? Or if someone's interested in, dating or making a friend, to have those kind of thoughts, as opposed to like, are you going to harm me? Like, what do you have it out for me? So that's one of many, many changes that happen in the brain, which is why the changes happen in gene transmission, right? Because then gene changes, what are called epigenetic changes, mean that when the genes are passed on, they're passed on in different ways. Some of them that would have been active are not. Some of them that would not have been active are active. And that's another downstream result of our brains being changed by trauma. So it's not a soft concept. It's not, anything that's negative, we should rue and it gives a person an excuse for anything. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about scientifically validated changes in the brain and in our genetics. And the three categories of experience that can create that. So the most obvious one is acute trauma, right? And the study of trauma really arises from military, from combat trauma, because it's an example of acute trauma, right? Someone is injured in battle, right? The soldier next to that person is killed in battle. And that's the model we use to study trauma for a long, long time. It can apply to other traumas too, the death of a loved one, a bad car accident, a bad injury, a bad illness, right? So a sexual assault, there's so many ways that acute trauma can overwhelm the coping skills. There are also chronic traumas that can overwhelm our coping skills just the same. So think about chronic denigration. Someone who just goes through life and whether it's a different ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexuality, who just constantly is facing that you're less than, and they come to see that like the world will treat me that way, right? Like I'm always last, I'm always least, right? And how many people does the world give that message to? Certainly in this country, many people who have a sense of being beleaguered, right? And a sense that the world around them sees them as less for something that's just natural about them, or something that they feel good about. Whether it's something natural or something they choose, it's something that person doesn't intrinsically feel bad about, because there's nothing to feel bad about, right? But the world around them says that there is. And that can create the same changes in the brain. So there's acute trauma, chronic trauma, and vicarious trauma. So, fortunately, right, we as human beings are blessed with empathy, right? We can feel for one another. It's part of how we can want to help one another. But that also means we can feel and experience other people's trauma. And you do see at times people who come intensely in contact with the trauma of other people have post-trauma syndromes. They have those changes in the brain. You see that with emergency response workers, firemen, EMTs, doctors and nurses, right? You see this with people, journalists at times, or you see this with people who are coming very, very close to trauma, and they're not able to separate themselves, their feelings, what's going on inside of them from what's going on in someone else. So, our empathy is a wonderful thing, but it can bring trauma to us as well. So there's acute, chronic, and vicarious traumas.
Here's something where I would like to push back a little bit towards you, and I hope that's okay, because like a problem that I have with those psychiatric definitions is I don't think they hit the core of the phenomenon, because a person like this is how I came in touch with trauma. Like my father is a war veteran in a way, and it's from a very early age, like I kind of became his pseudo psychiatrist in a way, and talk with him about these things for years and years and years and years, and notice the differences to his personality in a way. And from my observation, I kind of noted that it's not particularly the witnessing of these events, but the collapse of particular belief systems in regards to other people. For example, you see when I talk to somebody who was raped, for example, it's like their former idea of what a human being is capable of didn't integrate the malevolence to what they are witnessing. So they are, it's like the belief system collapses in a way, and they are lost in a way, and they are unable to decipher between neutral persons and threats because they haven't updated themselves and extract the wisdom from the degree that some people, you will meet people who are wolves in human skins in a way, or where it's like
Yes.
a person loses their child in an accident where they will be traumatized until they learn the painful lesson that horrible things can happen to good people in a way, because their motto of the world was like, if I do everything right, maybe the world will do right by me in a way. Are these observations that are made, like, would you agree with them to a certain degree? And do you understand with my badly English here why I feel like the psychiatry definitions are not as deep as they maybe are supposed to feel? You know what I mean?
Yes, not at all in terms of your description. It's absolutely cogent. I understand, and again, I have a very, very strong yes to all of that, because what you're describing is the truth of the human experience, right? You know, we can say, oh, guilt, shame, overwhelmed coping skills, right? But what you're doing is you're going that next step to really, I think, the phenomenology of it, right? And then the philosophical impact. So the phenomenology of like, what is that experience inside of like the terror of, I just realized like there are wolves in human, in human clothes, and I can't tell who they are, right? Like there's a terror to that. There's a sense of vulnerability to that really goes to the core, right? So there's that, the experience of it, and then what it changes in terms of core beliefs. So the idea that, right, I should be cynical. Why would I trust anyone, right? So that's not just the brain having an automatic increase in vigilance, right? But then it can affect our conscious minds too, right? Because now there's anger and resentment that, like, someone did something and someone hurt me, so I'm damn well not trusting anyone again, right? So our belief systems then change in the service of trying to protect ourselves, right? And in the service of trying to protect oneself, a person can cut themselves off from goodness, right? It can cut themselves off from good human relations. If someone who was sexually assaulted, right, realizes, oh my God, like that terror of not knowing that person was a wolf in human clothing is so awful that now I realize I can't trust anyone. So I'm not going to open myself up to any sort of intimacy. And now, instead of just like being careful, that person has locked themselves away at home, right? Then you see the awfulness that brings, like the just wholesale change to life because of the feelings that are created inside and how those feelings change our belief system. So yes, and I think that's where we can help one another. So you think about, Viktor Frankl's belief system about like the value of goodness, right, didn't change, right, despite the awfulness, and we can help one another, right, because we have our points of weakness where, when I've had several really bad traumas in the second half of my life, and I need other people to tell me that, right? When it's someone else's trauma, I can help them with it. I can help them see that like this doesn't change like their belief system, their belief in the possibility of human goodness. But there are times I've been on the other side of that table. So I think it shows even more powerfully how we need to support people in being able to express themselves, not hiding it away, being able to help one another, whether that's just interpersonally or in clinical settings, so that people don't have their life wholesale changed by the things that you mentioned, which I think really puts the color, like I drew an outline and you colored it in with the truth of the human experience of it.
Mm. What do you think is the antidote to trauma from a narrative perspective, maybe? Because here's one thing that's very strange to me in a way, where you mentioned that one of the reasons why you wrote your book was because you felt dissatisfied with the service that the psychiatric system is currently providing to the world. And it's, as a patient who was, for example, in a stationary psychiatry in a way, I felt it was very disempowering to go through the entire process, because you're presented with stories about who you are. You are diagnosed with depression, you have bipolar disorder, you have depression, you are bipolar, you're, I don't know, all these under identity psychotherapeutic terms. I feel that they give people stories, and I think that this is not only dangerous, it is completely the opposite of what the job of these institutions should be like. Because I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is because it is so obvious that something within you allied with like a heroic narrative of something tragic happened in my life, and I will use it to help others in a way. And I feel that this is, we lost that in a way. So long story short, it's, what do you think is the antidote to trauma, and did I hit the nail on the head to a certain degree, in a way that with our new instruments of measuring and diagnosing people, that we should be a little bit more careful about what we are prescribing to people, because often it's not just things but also stories that also have a negative consequences to it.
Again, I agree so strongly. I mean, you're speaking to a very important aspect of how the healthcare system, I think, in general in Western countries and in other nations too, I just know more about the US and the European world of healthcare, have become divorced from the people we're trying to help. So the systems then serve themselves, right? So look, why does everyone, there's something called the DSM here in America, right? It's a diagnostic and statistical manner. It's got, it's this thick, it's got all these diagnoses in it. And people talk about it, it
I hate that book.
Right. I can't stand, in a sense, there's a purpose to being able to like have research criteria in a book, right? But that's what it is, right? When people describe it as the Bible, you hear that it's the Bible, they refer it as if it's a religious book. And I think that there's little set on earth more misguided than that. That, oh, we're gonna elevate to religious significance, putting people into pigeonholed boxes. Then the field glorifies its own diagnostic structure, right? And then that's what it's serving as the field then, and I think the leadership in the field works to protect itself from the people we're serving, right? So that's why there's, look at all these checklists and this and that, and like notes typed into the computer. And I mean, I get it that we have to transfer information, but it's so ridiculous that what it does is it divorces sometimes entirely the person who is supposed to be the point of it all from the process around that person. And we can return to a way that is much more simple, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've said to a person, oh, this is what was my diagnosis? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, look, clearly the person's presenting and like they have signs and symptoms of depression, right? Like clearly it's okay, your mood is low and you don't feel hopeful or like you did before, and you feel sort of helpless and you're having trouble sleeping and you're having panic attacks. Like, I mean, we can go through the book and say, well, that's major depressive disorder, moderate, recurrent with panic disorder with, I mean, we could say, oh, why, right? Why don't we say, look, this is what's going on in you, right? Like, I know it because you told it to me, right? Like, let's talk more about it, right? And when you do that and you cut through all the rest of it that are just barriers and questionnaires and fill out this and fill out that and sit in the waiting room and come in, and now there's 15 minutes with somebody who's just trying to treat your symptom. You had said that early on of the diagnostic structure and symptoms. Often what the diagnostic structure is looking to do is identify symptoms and treat them. So if you come in and you tell me you're depressed or you give me signs and symptoms of depression, then I say, you're sleeping less. Okay, so that's, I identify that symptom. Then often what the system will do is want to treat the symptom and say, oh, we're successful because we treated the symptom. You might be just as depressed, right? It's the old adage that the surgery was a success, but the patient died, right? And I think that's how medicine, is sort of treating itself now, as opposed to saying, can we look at the whole person and say, what's going on in you? Can we talk about it? And it's within the simple, I mean, everything I'm driving towards, I think, in the book and in this interview and all the interviews I do, is around simplifying, right? That it's actually not that complicated to say, look, we're going to sit with someone, we're going to try and learn from that person what's going on in them. There's a vague diagnostic structure in case I'm communicating with someone else or some, but really I just want to understand and then open up an environment where that person can talk. An example of someone who's really just terribly impacted over years, depression, self-harm, by abuse as a child, someone who's abused by a coach, who had a whole narrative in their head of how that was their fault, right? And they'd never said anything to anyone, right? So then in the simple shared humanness of like, well, let's just talk about that. And as a person starts, talks a little bit, we build a safer environment and we're talking back and forth and like there's a real shared humanness. And then the person puts words to it, what's going on in their head for the first time ever, right? Which is, I was a child and someone who was charged with responsibility for me abused me. And then I went back. I've been telling myself forever, well, it's your fault. You went back. You must have liked it. You must have wanted it. Why? Because that's what that person told me, right? And I went back because I was afraid. In fact, as I think about it, I told a couple people, right? But it didn't get anything. Stephanie von Gutenberg writes about that in my interviews, talk about it in an interview, how many times a child has to say they're abused before they get attention, right, for it. So that person really, I did tell people. Now, as the person starts talking, an entirely different narrative for the first time in decades evolves right then, right? Which is of a child who, it wasn't that child's fault, right? The system didn't protect the child. The child went back because the child had no choice and the child wanted to belong and wanted the coach's approval and no one else was listening. And then there's a different conception from which that person then goes on and builds a healthier life. Right. And it's not always like that, where someone comes in, they change their life goes in an entirely different direction in one session. But the shared humanness, the ability to express, getting to the simple facts and basics of things, and maybe some medicines help that process along. The person now doesn't need any more, help their depression get to a better place, their mood is better, get them off the medicines. Right. It's a human endeavor. And that happens a lot where there is trauma in a person impacting their brain, impacting their conception of self, their choices, and that has a significant negative effect, pervasive in life, and that changes. And I think the lesson is, yes, that can change if we get back to the basics of helping people. That's not going to change with 15-minute appointments from people who make no eye contact because they don't have time, and therapists who are in some insurance system and can't schedule somebody back for 6 weeks, and all that crap that has nothing to do with actually understanding and helping someone. I'm shocked by how much, especially when I worked in systems, that I did all the time working in systems as a doctor, that had nothing whatsoever to do with helping anyone or keeping anyone safe, or, it had nothing to do with anything except serving, some menace somewhere that I had no contact with. It was inscrutable to me, like the what and why of it. But all I knew is I had no choice about it, right? If I wanted to work in the system, which is why I don't work in a system anymore.
Mm-hmm. That's a big, like I have to, this is a selfless question that I'm about to ask. I hope that's okay. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about, because it's I told you I'm launching, like, it's called the Behavior University, which is an attempt to put a toolkit with psychotherapeutic tools into the hands of every person in the world and have one place where all the therapists in the world stand. And one question that I often ask myself is the idea of, is there an element of arrogance in that? Like, should we fix the system that we have right now, or should we build a new one in a way? Because one of the things that I'm confused about is the lack of technology and the lack of advancement in the system that we currently have. Because right now it takes 7 years to become a psychotherapist, but by the time that is over, the world has changed to a degree where it's what is being taught isn't relevant to the degree it was in the beginning. Like times are wild right now. So I guess the question that I have for you is, like, as a young person who wants to help people like you to make the world a better place and maybe play a small role in this, what do we have to do? Like, how can we fix the system that we have, or is it time to maybe build a new one in a way? Like, how would you handle this in a way, or what is your way of attacking this global problem of major proportions? Yeah. I'm sorry, that was a very, very strange question, but I tried to ramble in a little bit.
Yeah, no, I like the question because it speaks to what you're doing. It speaks to what I'm doing too. I mean, I've thought about this because I work outside of a system, right? I have a clinic. There's almost 30 of us working together, working outside of systems. And I think that it is morally and ethically justified to set up novel ways of being or doing outside of systems when the systems have shown themselves to be so resistant to change and there's so much inertia. I mean, there's so much power and money in the insurance-driven healthcare system in the United States that I don't believe that I can make changes to it from the inside. I just don't see how that can happen. I think in bureaucratic systems that have so much inertia and so many financial incentives, right? It is very, very difficult. It's like you can't change, you can't turn a giant oil tanker on a dime, right? You can't do that. You can't rapidly turn it. Now, you might make a degree of change one way and then you see that change down the road, but that's not so clear. You might make a degree of change one way and then a degree of change back is made back. So I think if we assess, like, I don't think I can enact change from within, then we are, I believe, morally and ethically justified in enacting change from without, right? And I think that what happens there, and I'm even thinking back to Hegel, I think the German philosopher, and I'm no great expert, but when I think about processes of change, how things change, right? It's not in some linear way, right? I mean, often something different, something in opposition to something is posited, right? And then that thing gets, in some sense, incorporated, like what's learned from it can impact that system. It's not that, oh, the whole healthcare or education system is going to come around to like my way of thinking or your way of thinking. Like, I'd like that, right? But it's unlikely, right? What's more likely is that we impact the systems by showing and saying, right, that things can be different, right? And then it opens up, I think, the degrees of freedom for others to enact change. It sort of thaws out a little bit the systems that are stuck. So I think that we can impact the systems by declaring and then creating different ways of being that are in opposition to how the systems work. Not because it's like it's them or us, so to speak, but because the knowledge, the learning, the experience, right, of the new thing can impact then the old thing, and sometimes get enough attention that it can catalyze change. So that's my belief in the moral and ethical justification of what I do, operating entirely outside of systems. And I would think, from what I understand of your aspirations, your strivings, your endeavors, I think the same thought process would apply, as you're doing something different in the service of making things better. And I think there doesn't need to be more than that. It's like, not what do you want to be, but how do you want to be? I think that's how you want to be, right? You want to be in a way that's different, that doesn't just accept all of this, right? And I think you can kind of, that's enough. You can hang your hat, so to speak, on that's how I'm being. And I think that that's a good way to make the world better.
If everybody in the world has, like, one of the side projects that I'm involved in is I just partnered up with one of the person who built the first AI therapist in the world, and we are going to make like little avatars of every therapist there is, so that their wisdom can survive the test of time and maybe even help people in the future. So the question basically here is, like, if you could have a session with everybody in the world, in a way, like, what would the content of it be in regards to your specialties in a way? And does it even make sense from a question? I think, like, what I'm trying to figure out is, like, if you could maybe put a tool in the toolkit of every individual in the world, like, what would that be like? And what do you want to preserve for the world in a way?
The answer to that, I think, very good immediate answer to that is helping every person get in touch with the goodness inside of them, right? And I'm not implying everyone is completely out of touch with it, right? But a lot of people are. I mean, there's a lot of depression, misery, right, hopelessness in the world around us, and that is a reflection of our internal states too. I mean, we almost never see someone who's like, look, there's a lot of goodness in me, an ability to make change and be good to people. Oh, and I feel helpless and hopeless, right? So the person feels in the same state inside as they see the world around them. They see a world that we recoil from, right? And then we don't see within ourselves the goodness that can make a difference on a bigger scale or just on a smaller scale. And even if a person is in touch with the goodness inside of themselves, let's double down on that, right? Let's reinforce that, because it kind of comes full circle to the beginning of our conversation about knowing that there's goodness inside of us, goodness that we can give away, that, you know, I can share a smile or a good deed or word with someone, tells me of my own worth. It reminds me I'm alive, right? I have something to both give to and get back from the world. And I think way too many people are not nearly in touch with that, and have that sense of like running at full speed, right, in order to just survive. And then there is no give, there's no extra goodness, right? There's not a perception then that there's enough of it to go around. The person feels impoverished often of goodness in a world that they feel is impoverished of goodness, right? And I would come directly at the goodness inside of the person, which have yet to be able to not find in someone, right? No matter how down and out or how negative someone may feel. Like if someone trips and falls in front of you face first on the floor, like you can help that person up, or you can say something nice to them, or you can alert someone. Like you can do something good in the world. And again, I'll stand by that as the value in being alive, right? Like there's value in life up against anything. There's nothing I think that can be posited that takes away, right, the truth that then knowing that value and goodness in the self shores that person up against often a difficult and stressful world, and reminds that person that they have good to give to others and they have good for themselves.
Aren't we spectacular species where the sensation of helping others is the greatest gift that we can make to ourselves? It's I'm dumbfounded by the kind of reputation that we have in regards to ourselves. It's one of the things I hear every day on the media, is how bad humans are, and that we shouldn't have kids anymore, and that it would be better if we wouldn't be here anymore. We are like cancer and we should be eradicated, and all those kind of things that humanity has wrestled for so very long. Do you maybe have a message for people who are disencouraged by life? Because that's like, if something traumatic happened to you, that's not too big of a leap. Like if you have somewhat been betrayed by beings, that you are not too big of a fan of it. Like what would you tell to those people maybe who are on the edge, if you could talk to them, at least to the couple of thousands that will listen to our me rambling and interrupting you all the time in this conversation?
No, I love this conversation. And again, I love what you're asking. I mean, you're talking about really important things that don't get talked about enough. Like for example, acknowledging that yes, like there are malicious or malevolent people who behave that way, right? But that malice or that malevolence is born, I believe, it's born of trauma. It's born of desperation. It's born of misery. And it exists in the world. And each one of us, like, I think, has to face that truth, right? But that doesn't mean there isn't goodness in the world, or that there aren't ways that we can work against the desperation, right? The sickness in the world around us that creates people who are malicious, right? We can work against it by harnessing the goodness that's in each one of us and reminding ourselves that that stands against the negative. Like, yes, it's true that there are hurtful people who enact hurtful systems and do awful things, right? Like, we know that's true, but it's born of exactly the thing we're fighting against. I mean, you show me someone who's like very hurtful to other people, who, if you really understood, you can't find some trauma in their life. Like, I've not seen that once, right? If someone is being hurtful, malevolent, it's traceable to something that makes desperation, misery inside of that person. And that stands in direct opposition to finding the goodness in ourselves that stands against that and can change that equation going forward. So if you can find the goodness inside of you to do something for me, right, then it says to you, it proves to you that there's more to life than that malevolence, right? Because you see it, you find it in yourself. You have an experience of self, of happiness, right? An experience of being enough, of being good enough. So good, in fact, in the moment that there's something you can give away, right? And I think those are really oppositional concepts. You know, the beleaguered, cynical, angry, hurtful person, right, who is always a miserable person, right, and has no goodness to spare, and a person who, even in the worst of circumstances, like Viktor Frankl, right, can find goodness to give away to someone else. And it's very clear, if you stand back from that, one group of people is destructive and miserable, and the other group of people could do wonderful things in the world, even on it just have to be on a big way, like on a just on a person by person basis, and is cognizant of the goodness inside of them, and of the importance and value of life. And like, we can, each of us, alter that towards the goodness, right, by not becoming so cynical and so overwhelmed when we see and acknowledge and witness the things that are bad. I don't know if it's the best answer, but it comes back around to being able to find the goodness in ourselves and to believe in its power, including its power to change our societies over time, that we don't have to have the balance, so to speak, that we have between good and evil now. Like, it can be better.
Well, what better person to lead us to a spiritual epidemic, but a person who believes that everybody has like a divine particle within them that is unextinguishable. So I think that was a beautiful point that you made in a way. And I think this was such a long conversation. I want to be respectful of your time. Could you also maybe tell people how they can find you and how they can support you on your mission of making this world a lighter place?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. There's a website for me, and the website has links to some podcasts. So this will be on there when it's up and running.
Can you say the website for people who are listening right now?
Yeah. It also has links to the book, to purchase the book. So links to media stuff and links to the book. And it's just drpaulconti.com. And the doctor is DR. So just DRPAULCONTI. So drpaulconti.com. And then the clinic that we have here, and again, there are about 30 of us working together now, is called Pacific Premier Group. So pacificpremiergroup.com links you to the clinic, which describes, you know, how we work. Like, there are videos there, and there's language around our approach. So that could be of help if someone's not necessarily going to come to us, right? But it says, okay, how do we work? How do we approach trying to help people? So a lot of that information is in that website. So between drpaulconti.com and pacificpremiergroup.com, there's some information to be had there.
I will put everything in the show notes. And last question, no, 2 questions. Then I promise I will shut up finally.
No worries.
I feel as an author, it's always very interesting what one intended to do with the book and what people would do with it in a way. I always like to end a session, like a coaching session or a counseling session, with a homework. The homework today will obviously be to buy your book and read it thoroughly in a way. If you could give them a particular way in how they should read it, or like an exercise on top of it where they can read through the knowledge that you shared with them so generously, because God knows you don't make a lot of money with those books. Like in general, it's such an effort in a way. It's more something like a gift to humanity. This is how I see books in a way. So what's like a way that people could use the wisdom that you shared with them in that book to transfer it in the real life? Like, if you would give them a quest or a homework exercise or something on top that comes with your book through this podcast. Not sure if this makes sense. Could you understand what I was trying to get at?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I don't know. Tell me if I'm answering the question or not. You know, the book is meant to be able to be just picked up and read. it's not meant as an academic text, right? It's just meant as a book you can pick up and start reading, and it's not that hard or long to get through. It's meant to be consumable, right? And I think to just pick it up and read it without, the thought of like, well, trying to, in a sense, learn too much. Like, if you want to learn more about something, you can revisit it, right? If someone's, the brain biology section, I want to learn more, you can revisit that in the book. You can research it in other ways. But to pick it up and to see it as potentially, hopefully, relevant to oneself and to the people a person loves and to the broader world around us, and to sort of read it in that way, in a sense, the way a person would read fiction. Right. I mean, there's stories in it and anecdotes in it, and it's meant to be consumed in that way, and then to spark thought and reflection, and if it sparks, a person wants to write afterwards or go talk to someone around them or learn more about one thing or another, that's great. But I think I would maybe pick it up and read it like a work of fiction, which is kind of how it is, I guess, how it was written, that the person can just go through it without having the weightiness of partitions and learn this so that you could see what comes next. I mean, I tried to make it not that way. It could just be seen as an overview of the human condition, perhaps.
Beautiful, beautiful. I will put that in the book recommendation and link below. Last question, then we got it. I stole that question from an old interview where I think Bertrand Russell was interviewed. I like that question very much. If only the following part could survive the test of time, and in 100 years from now, there would be like a time capsule, and this segment would be part of it. Like, what kind of advice would you like to preserve to future generations if it could only be 3 pieces of advice?
Okay, so
or maybe lessons you collected over your lifetime in a way that stand out for you as a person, that's something that you want to give future generations as a parting gift, so to say, with the standard wisdom that you have right now.
Well, when I look back on my own life, 50 something years, I can't identify a time when acting in a way that was not consistent with gratitude and humility was actually a good thing. Right? It may have seemed like it in the short term, but when I really stand back and I look at my own life, my own health and happiness, my own achievements, they've all come with a sense of gratitude and humility attached to them. And I am all in support of making the most of ourselves that we can and choose, right? So I'm all for people's strivings, whatever that may be. If your striving is to sit on the edge of the bed today and then get back into it, sit on the edge of the bed and feel great about it, right? If your striving is you want to go have 4 PhDs from Harvard, go strive for that, right? So I'm all for strivings that makes us better, explore the world around us, but do so through a lens of humility and gratitude. And I think what we find is everything is better. It doesn't lead to like, oh, nice people finish last or whatever. Like, none of that is true. That our strivings and our ambition can come hand in hand with humility and gratitude. And I think the outcome is health and happiness and contributing to making the world better.
It was a tremendous honor to speak to you today. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
And it means a lot that you've been so generous with your time and your attention and patience with me, particularly because it's not my first language. And for everybody who listens, please check out the book from Dr. Paul Conti. It's one that I highly recommend you reading. Also support a psychiatry in any way you can form. And I think that's it. I think we got it today, Paul, yeah?
Yes, I want to thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. This was such a thoughtful interview, and it allowed things to come out that haven't come out in other venues. So I'm very grateful to you for having me on. So thanks so much.
Of course. Maybe we can manage a part 2, because I scheduled more than 300 more questions that I didn't meant to ask you today. I didn't get to ask you. So there has to be a part 2. Thank you so much, Paul. I will let you go right now. Thank you for listening, everybody. See you next episode.
You're welcome. Take care. Thank you.